Hey all, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the show. Have you ever tried methylene blue? How is it that methylene blue went from a 19th century textile dye and fish tank cleaner to a futuristic cutting-edge mitochondrial-enhancing compound that sets your brain on fire and turns your tongue blue? You've probably heard the buzz around the mythical and sketchy-sounding synthetic compound known as methylene blue. For me, after unfortunate run-ins surviving carbon monoxide poisoning, black mold exposure, and chronic Lyme disease, methylene blue earned its spot in my bag of tricks many moons ago. Should it be in yours? With mitochondrial dysfunction affecting a whopping 94% of adults in the United States, I'd say it's worth a look. We're here today with one of the foremost experts and thought leaders, integrating intriguing compounds like methylene blue into their practice, Dr. Scott Sherr. While methylene blue is an incredible tool for healing and performance optimization of the brain and body, it's not right for everyone. Since methylene blue can interact with certain medications and supplements, and we're still learning about its effects on the microbiome, it's essential to be strategic and intentional about sourcing, dosage, and frequency of use. Dr. Scott is here to separate the truth from the hype. Quick plug before we get to the interview, please take a quick moment to make sure that you're subscribed to the Abel James Show wherever you listen to your podcasts. To stay up to date, make sure that you sign up for my newsletter at abeljames.com. You can also sign up for my Substack as a free or paid member for ad-free episodes of this show. You can comment on each episode, and you can also hit me up in the DMs. You can join my Substack at abeljames.substack.com. All right, in this episode, you're about to discover how to improve metabolic and mitochondrial function with low-dose methylene blue, which supplements and pharmaceuticals interact with methylene blue and what to do about it, how hyperbaric oxygen therapy and high-altitude training can improve performance, and much more. Let's hang out with Dr. Sherr. Welcome back, folks. Dr. Scott Sherr is a board-certified internal medicine physician, expert in hyperbaric oxygen therapy, a leading voice in integrative medicine and health optimization, and a father of four. Dr. Scott is also the COO of Troscriptions, a company revolutionizing wellness with pharmaceutical-grade methylene blue and other cutting-edge formulations. His educational videos about methylene blue are some of the best I've ever seen. So thanks so much for joining us here today, Dr. Scott.
It's great to be here with you, Abel. Thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. Now, methylene blue, when you look into it, has an absolutely fascinating history, being synthesized in the mid-1800s as a textile dye and then going on to be implemented widely in the military and beyond for use as an antimicrobial drug to treat malaria and other pathogens, but kind of randomly and accidentally, as with most drugs in their development. So maybe you could share a little bit about how methylene blue went from this 19th century textile dye to this now cutting edge health optimization tool and intervention for biohackers.
Yeah, it's a really great question, right? There's like such a history behind it, and it's very rich and very blue, as you well know, Abel, and lots of blue urine, and at
Yes.
very high doses, other blue secretions like poop and tears and things like that. But that's at
Fish
really high
tanks
doses.
and like
And
it
fish
gets
tanks. Yeah, there's all these crazy things, and like lots of great puns you can use with the blue, like bluing yourself and bluing others, and I got blue, and why are you not blue? And May the 4th, may go blue yourself, and things like that. And so we had a lot of fun with that when we first started thinking about methylene blue back in 2020, way before it was cool. Although, as you were describing, 1897 was actually the first time methylene blue was used. It was actually the first drug that was approved by our FDA at that time, and it was approved for malaria, as you mentioned. But the backstory there is that it was a textile dye. It was developed as a fully synthetic textile dye to dye things blue. And if you had blue jeans, maybe Levi Strauss back in the 1870s, I think they were around back then, you would have blue jeans that were dyed with methylene blue. But interestingly enough, and I don't know exactly, nobody really knows exactly how this came about, but they were testing all of these new compounds because they were looking for something that could treat infection. Like, this is a time where there was no antibiotics, no antimicrobials. None of that stuff existed until the 1940s and 50s, really until penicillin came around. So before that, there were really few remedies out there. And they were testing all these various compounds, including some of these dyes, including methylene blue, against malaria. And they found that you could use methylene blue specifically at very high doses and kill malaria, and you wouldn't harm the normal cells, the human host. And this is why it actually got the name of a magic bullet at the time, because this magic bullet definition at that time was kills things but doesn't kill what you don't want it to kill, right? So and very few things were able to do that. And so methylene blue became the first antimicrobial available as a drug that was registered with the FDA. And so between 1897 and 1950, higher doses of methylene blue, over about a milligram per kilogram, so 70 milligrams at the lowest end, or maybe 50 to 70 milligrams, to as high as maybe 250 milligrams, was kind of like the dosing that would be used for urinary tract infections, fungal infections, even viral infections. Actually, it was quite commonly used for. And even up until the 1960s and 70s, methylene blue was used in many countries actually as a viral infection treatment. What would happen is if you had a sore throat, your mom or dad would paint the back of your mouth with methylene blue. And I was actually speaking to somebody just a couple of weeks ago from Eastern Europe. I think she was from Czechoslovakia, actually, and she grew up that her mom would paint all their mouths with methylene blue when they had a viral infection. And so even back, going back to World War II, as you were mentioning earlier, like when you were in World War II, if you were going to the Pacific, you had to take methylene blue prophylactically because it would prevent things like getting fungal infections, et cetera. And so they all these stories and songs about it, about peeing blue in the loo, basically the loo being the bathroom, right? Actually, it was even Eisenhower himself that talked about taking it during World War II and having these experiences. And so that was the first real chapter of methylene blue, and really significant impact on the capacity to have an antimicrobial. Nothing existed at that time. And from there, things changed, because as antimicrobials came around in the 1950s, methylene blue became less popular because it had this side effect, right, which is benign, but it does make your urine blue. And so for the most part, people didn't want their urine to be blue. There was these new exciting medications that came out. And so that methylene blue kind of came less involved in the human world, but then from there had like this new evolution in fish tanks, as you well pointed out, and also in biochemistry as a stain in cells. And in addition, the first antipsychotics were actually derived from methylene blue, because methylene blue has this other property called being a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which just means that it has this capacity to increase norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. So three of your major neurotransmitters that we can talk about later, but those are really important, obviously, too. A lot of our antidepressants now, although there's a lot of controversy around antidepressants, but those antidepressants that we have now are based on similar kinds of ideas, and also some of our antipsychotics. So you have this new way of making antipsychotics from methylene blue. You have this capacity now to clean fish tanks, and because just like it cleans humans, it actually cleans the fish too. But I don't recommend drinking fish tank cleaner, everybody, because methylene blue has contamination capacity, and we can talk about that. And then the staining part is probably the last piece to mention here, because what happens, and this is actually something that I actually did in biochemistry when I was in college, you can use methylene blue to dye certain parts or stain certain parts of your cell, specifically your mitochondria. And that's where things get very, very interesting, because that's really the power of methylene blue now that we're seeing in the biohacking, performance, wellness, endurance, regeneration, chronic inflammation, because mitochondrial dysfunction is such a big problem. And what methylene blue can do is actually concentrate in the mitochondria and make it work better in a number of different ways.
So when people are getting into something like this, it's kind of hard to understand and conceptualize, because at first, like for them, it was old fashioned because it made you pee blue. Now a lot of people are just like, oh, it's from the future because it makes you pee blue. It's a
True.
fascinating thing
It's
that's
true.
going on. But why
Yeah.
do you think it's been, and maybe this is me reading too much into it, but as an effective therapy, aside from the obvious, pretty benign side effect of blue urine, why has it been swept under the rug for so many other treatments that are, supposedly impossible to treat or denied by modern medicine, or at least historically, like Lyme disease or some of these other issues? But why do you think methylene blue has been so underrepresented as a therapy?
I think there's a number of things there. Number one is that we all love new, shiny objects. And when the new, shiny object comes into our field of view, everything else gets thrown away. This is like a perfect example. I have 4 kids, like you mentioned, and something is new in my house. It is amazing for like 3 to 5 days. And then everything else, it just kind of goes back into the background like everything else. And so when even though methylene blue was very, very good at what it did back in the 40s and 50s, when you had penicillin come around, and it's like, holy shit, this is like this new drug, and it has all this, and it works so quickly, and it's like it's the next thing since it's the most amazing thing, right? And then there's new drugs, and there's a new drugs, and there's like, and then of course there's the profit margins associated with that, because the longer something's been around, the less it's going to cost. And that's the thing about methylene blue, because it's been around such a long time. There is less interest in doing studies, although this is actually starting to happen a little bit more now, because they're using what drug companies are trying to do is take derivations of methylene blue and find drugs to make out of it, as this is what we do, right? Because our culture and our sort of capitalist drives are to make as much money as possible. And so if it's not making a lot of money, people aren't putting a lot of emphasis on it. And as a result of that, that's one of the major reasons why methylene blue has kind of been like this sleeper compound, because it's been around a while. It has all this great research, and more research actually that has been done in the last couple of decades, especially in mitochondrial optimization, mitochondrial function, improving mitochondrial function. I think the other aspects of this, and it's an important one, is that methylene blue is the first fully synthetic drug that was ever made, which means that it didn't come from nature directly. Now, of course, everything comes from nature sort of indirectly because of the chemical structures and having to make things from other compounds. But because it's the first fully synthetic compound, that also, on the other end of it, the people that want to be natural and ancestral, right, and others like that are like, oh, I don't want to take anything that's not and that's not from the ground. And so I understand that piece, and because it's an important one. What I often say is, I'm a medical doc. I've been in practice for a long time. Not everything synthetic is bad for you, as just like not everything natural is good for you. I mean, as you know, Abel, probably, like, you can go to forage the wrong mushrooms and die of liver failure, which I've seen happen, right? And not only just synthetic versus non-synthetic or natural, it's also dose dependence, right? And I think a lot of the controversy around methylene blue most recently has been around the dosing specifically. And people out there talking about how methylene blue can be toxic, and it can cause your sperm counts to go down, and it's going to cause brain problems and things like that, because they're talking about too high of a dose as well. And so it's a dosing issue. It's a synthetic versus natural thing. It's been around such a long time. And as you mentioned, like, I didn't think about sort of like the old sort of new blue thing, where like in the 60s and like in 70s, everything synthetic was actually amazing, right? But now we're kind of more of a natural movement, which is overall better. And that sort of blue thing kind of looks futuristic too. I didn't think about that sort of dichotomy though, which is kind of fun.
It's quite bizarre. But let's talk a little bit more about what methylene does when you take it. Then we can talk about dosing, because that's certainly another issue. But in terms of the issues that most people are struggling with, metabolic dysfunction, mitochondrial dysfunction, what's happening when you take a little bit of methylene blue in your system?
Yeah. So what we know is happening is that methylene blue is concentrating in that mitochondria, right? But what people don't realize, so when I was in sixth grade or seventh grade, and just like a couple of my kids have just recently been, I watched them learn science or biology. And when you learn science and biology in sixth and seventh grade, you learn that you have a cell. It has a nucleus. It has cytoplasm. It has this thing called a mitochondria in it, and it has other things like the Golgi apparatus and endoplasmic reticulum and other things. These are all organelles. But you learn that there's like one mitochondria in there, but that's actually not the case. There are some cells in our body that have thousands of mitochondria per cell, and we have other cells in our body that have zero. Do you actually know the one cell in our body that has no mitochondria, Abel? This is kind of a fun fact.
No
It would
mitochondria.
so it used to have mitochondria, and then it got rid of it so that it could carry oxygen better. It's our red blood cells. So our red blood cells, when they're maturing, they initially have mitochondria, but then they get rid of their mitochondria so they can just carry more oxygen. But in essence, we have the most mitochondria per cell in eggs and sperm. Making a baby takes a lot of work, especially for the female. That's why eggs have the most mitochondria per cell of any type of cell in the human body. And outside of that, we have the brain, the heart, the liver, musculoskeletal tissue. And so what do people have symptomatically when they have mitochondrial dysfunction? They have brain fog, concentration problems, fertility issues, cardiac detox, exercise-induced fatigue, a lot of cognitive symptoms because the brain is so intensively making energy, right? Because that's what the mitochondria do. The mitochondria make this energy currency called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And another fun fact, we make about 165 pounds of ATP every single day. That's a huge amount of energy. And that doesn't stick around for very long. It's always being recycled and used in various ways. But the thing about making energy is that it's not, there's a cost to making energy. When we make ATP, we don't just make ATP, we also make water, carbon dioxide, which we breathe off, and also is a major signaling molecule. And we also make what are called reactive oxygen species, these small little molecules of oxygen that are unpaired electrons that cause a little bit of stress to the system, but they're all at these small levels are really important for signaling. Like, how much energy should you make? Should I make more? Should I make less? Do I have to kind of repurpose what I'm doing to, to get other resources in other locations? But the problem is that, mitochondrial dysfunction is such a huge issue. Like 94% of the U.S. population has some element of mitochondrial dysfunction. That's a huge amount, and as a result, people can't either make energy effectively because they don't have the capacity to do that, or they don't have the capacity to detox with that, those reactive oxygen species that get built up over time, and that requires antioxidants. So on both ends of this, you have energy production and you have energy detoxification. They're both extremely essential, and 94% of the U.S. population, U.S. adults, can't do some of this. Okay, so that's a preamble to talk about what methylene blue does, because just the context here is that in the mitochondria itself, that energy production part is something called the electron transport chain. It's this chain of proteins that flows electrons through them. These electrons actually come from our food, come from fat, come from carbohydrates, and less so come from proteins. But depending if you are a fat burning man or if you're a carbohydrate burning man, depending on the majority of your electrons from your food are going to go into your mitochondria, and they're going to go through this cycle and help you make energy. But the problem with those complexes is that many of us have deterioration of those complexes. Many of us can't make energy well. And then on the detox side, they can't, do something with that oxidative stress, those reactive oxygen species. So the most common reasons why people have mitochondrial dysfunction, number one is insulin resistance. So if you have high blood sugars, you're not making energy well, you're not detoxing well. Number two is a big category, stress. Stress could be from chronic sympathetic dominance. So your fight or flight nervous system is on all the time and depleting neurotransmitters, neurohormones, and mitochondrial dysfunction. It could be from a toxic relationship, from trauma in your past. It could be toxic, lots of things, toxic exposures, et cetera. Infections, post-infectious syndromes. So your long COVIDs, your chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, things like that with maybe a infectious component. And then medications as well. Like a lot of the common medications that people take can actually affect mitochondrial function too. Most common ones that a lot of people will take are things like metformin, proton pump inhibitors like Prilosec and Protonix, even other, and a lot of other drugs will do it. So that's kind of I wanted to give that kind of background. Now, before I get into methylene blue, do you have any questions about all of that?
Oh, keep steaming. This is great.
Okay, cool. All right.
Although I didn't realize that about metformin. That's interesting.
Yes, the metformin is actually a complex 1 destroyer. So what metformin does, it's a diabetic drug for those that don't know. It's been around a long time. What metformin does is it actually, so there's 4 complexes on the mitochondria, complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's what they're called. Complex 1 and 2 are the most important two that pick up those electrons from your food and bring it into the electron transport chain. Everybody's heard of NAD. The NAD these days, NAD. Some people like to call it NAD. I don't like to call it NAD. That's weird. But NAD is what I call it. And then there's FAD, FAD, and that goes to complex 2. And so what metformin does is actually blocks complex 1, which puts more stress on the mitochondria. So what the mitochondria does as a result of that is makes new mitochondria to help compensate for that. And so newer mitochondria are going to have better mitochondria and better complexes, at least initially. But I'm not a big fan actually of using of metformin long term, especially from an anti-aging longevity perspective, because it's doing this. a little bit of stress is good. And I think maybe periodic, I don't know, it depends on the person. But I think if you're exercising and you're otherwise doing other healthy things, I don't think metformin is necessary for most healthy people or on the path of health optimization. But yeah, so people don't realize that like a lot of your medications are actually having effect, if not directly on the mitochondria, indirectly. So like, for example, I did it. I have a friend of mine, his name's John Kim. He's a PhD pharmacist. And I had a long conversation with him about all these medications that are depleting antioxidants, that are depleting vitamins, minerals, and nutrients. The most common actually is birth control pills, because birth control pills deplete a number of your electrolytes, or excuse me, your minerals like magnesium, zinc, and I think it's copper as well. And so these are all affecting how well you can make energy. So that's why it's so important. The larger context for me always is, well, how are we optimizing people's health? It's not just going to be giving them methylene blue, although it can be very, very helpful. But it's what is the larger picture here, the ecosystem that this goes in. And this is kind of all related to, sidebar, which I can get back to later, something called Health Optimization Medicine, which is a nonprofit organization that we run that helps train practitioners on how to optimize something called metabolomics, which is the study of these small molecules that are all working in real time in our cells to help us optimize energy production, detoxification, cellular function, gut, neurotransmitters, hormones. So that's kind of like the base foundation for me as a clinician. But a lot of people are starting at a place where they need a lot of help. And this is where methylene blue can come in. Because now that you understand a little bit about energy production, detoxification, the key thing to understand about methylene blue is that methylene blue can help enhance energy production. It can compensate for any aspect of dysfunction in that energy production capacity, those complexes that we just mentioned. And at the same time, it can work directly as an antioxidant. So picking up some of that free radical reactive oxygen species that might be in too high of a supply and work directly as an antioxidant. So because of that, it has profound implications in helping people across the spectrum of health, because in essence, what it's called a redox cycler, REDOX, redox cycler, meaning it can help with reduction oxidation, fancy for saying it can donate and accept electrons in the mitochondria, helping you make or dispose of the waste products of energy metabolism.
So the problem is that more than 9 out of 10 people have underperforming cells in mitochondria. And when they're underpowered, this is extremely stressful on not just the cell itself, but the whole system, right? And so we have this happening at scale year after year, year after year. And that doesn't seem to be getting much better, but what a powerful tool to have. And I know that when I first um, started experimenting with methylene blue, just a small amount, I felt it immediately. And they're really, having taken almost every supplement ever, having hosted a podcast for more than a decade or whatever, it's just like you get sent everything. I've tried most things, and to be honest, you don't feel most things, and most most of these products also probably don't do much. But boy, methylene blue is different. So let's talk quickly about dosing, because maybe we can just address the big piece. Basically, if you're talking about like 250 milligrams, this is an IV. This isn't something that you're doing at home, generally speaking, just experimenting or playing around and hurting yourself. So maybe you can talk about the difference between those two extremes of what's going on here.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you mention your experience, right, Abel? Because the key I found is that methylene blue does have a profound effect on most people, but it's also going to be dose dependent. And it's very important to understand that what we found over the years, and so we've been working now clinically with methylene blue now for about 5 years. Most people have just heard about it within the last 6 months, probably, of hearing this podcast. And that's cool. It's exciting that people now hear about it, have maybe like a slight understanding of maybe what it does or maybe what other people are using it for. But the key to understand with dosing is that lower doses are extremely effective for mitochondrial support. So we're talking about 4 milligrams, 8 milligrams, 16 milligrams, 25 milligrams, maybe up to 30, maybe up to 40 milligrams. But really, the lower the dose, the best way to describe this is that what I found overall is that people are taking too high of a dose initially, and then they might have side effects. They might not feel very good. And then we always want to have like the lowest dose that's going to be most effective, right? And so what we now know is that from mitochondrial support perspective, most people will actually significantly benefit somewhere between about 4 to about 25 milligrams in general. But if you find most products out there, most products will be dosing anywhere between 40, 50, 100, or even more milligrams in the dosing. And the problem with that is that these lower doses of methylene blue are actually very supportive for mitochondrial function. They can enhance the energy, they can help with detoxification. But as you get to be higher on the doses, you get to be like, especially around about a milligram per kilogram. So that on average, it's going to be about 50 to 70 milligrams in the US, maybe more, maybe like depending on what the average weight of a human is these days. But 50 to 70 milligrams, so 50 to 70 milligrams is kind of where you're getting to be about that 1 milligram per kilogram. And what happens around that dosing is that it becomes anti-infective. It's also great for acute stress, acute infection, acute trauma, and we can talk about that. But the reason why it becomes more stressful on the system is because around those doses, you're making not only more energy, but you're also making more of something called hydrogen peroxide in the system. And hydrogen peroxide, people know about hydrogen peroxide. You can go to the store and get it, and you can use it as an antiseptic. But our cells actually use hydrogen peroxide as a fantastic anti-infective. And it's actually great because most antibiotics, as many of you that are listening know, stop working over a period of time because these bugs become resistant. But bugs can't become resistant to hydrogen peroxide like they can to other mechanisms of action of these other antibiotics and antimicrobials. And so these higher doses of methylene blue, you get this hydrogen peroxide produced. You got a profound anti-infective capacity. However, what happens also is that if you're increasing hydrogen peroxide in the system, you're forcing the body to make more antioxidants, specifically glutathione. And what happens if you've already been sick for a while, if you have a chronic complex medical illness, if you've been having chronic fatigue for a while, chronic inflammation, you're depleting all of these antioxidants. And you're depleting your capacity to make them too. And so if you suddenly give yourself a huge amount of methylene blue, all of a sudden the body's like, holy shit, what am I doing? What do I do with all this? I don't have the capacity to make glutathione, for example, and I have all this hydrogen peroxide. So you're going to feel badly. Okay. And so the key is to start off, especially if you're just kind of starting your health journey or on the beginnings of that, with these lower doses, because it's not as stressful to give 4, 8, 16 milligrams. You're just slowly getting enough methylene blue in there to enhance the ability for you to make energy and help with that detoxification side too, without causing the stress of making all that hydrogen peroxide. And the other issue here too, Abel, is that dosing is extremely important, but also the quality of the methylene blue you're taking, because the challenge is that the quality of methylene blue is kind of all across the board at this point, because the way it's developed, or the way actually it's made, it's not unlikely, it's very common, unfortunately, to get it contaminated with heavy metals, things like lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. So you don't want those things, obviously. And if you're taking high amounts of a methylene blue that's contaminated, you're going to be getting more of that as well. And so a big push for what I do, and what I've worked with clinically and with our company, is to make sure we get the cleanest methylene blue possible, and also precision of dosing. A lot of the liquids out there, for example, none of them that we tested actually met any of their label claims for their potency. So they're all weaker than they say. And that's because methylene blue in a liquid form is very unstable, and it deteriorates very quickly into something called azure blue. Azure blue is a metabolite of methylene blue, and azure blue itself it's not as active as a mitochondrial enhancer, but it's more active as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So it increases your norepinephrine more, and serotonin and dopamine, so it could be a little more dangerous. And so I don't like liquids for that reason. We've been asked to make liquids many years, and I always say no because of these issues. And so, what actually a number of people have come by, and over the years, a clinician of mine, a friend of mine, his name's Ashley, and she was taking methylene blue for a Lyme co-infection, and she was telling me that she was taking one methylene blue that was liquid at maybe like 8 milligrams, let's say, and then she took one that was not a liquid in a buccal troche form, and it was like night and day, because if you have precision of dosing. So there's a lot of information out there that people are probably now learning about methylene blue, but the key really is low dosing is almost always the way you want to go. Even if you need a high dose, like for a chronic infection, like a Lyme co-infection or something, oftentimes you want to start off at 4, 8, 16 milligrams or something, and then increase your dose slowly over time. So the way I always work with it is that I titrate every 3 to 5 days. So start at 4 milligrams. Increase your dose in 3 days to 8 milligrams, then to 12, then to 16. And so once you start feeling better, that could be the dose we want to keep you on. Or if we're not quite sure, we might want to keep going up. Or if it's more of a chronic infection. We might have to keep going up on the dose even higher. But in essence, what I always say is that, I guess the last piece to this would be that people always ask me the question, well, how often do I need to take methylene blue? And my answer to that question is some people need to take methylene blue some of the time. And then some of the people need to take methylene blue all of the time for a period of time. And what I mean by that is that if you have a lot of chronic mitochondrial stress, methylene blue is a fantastic way to start feeling a little bit better, getting a little bit more energy, getting a little more detox, and then titrate your dose to feel good so that all of a sudden you're able to do some of the things that you weren't able to do before. Maybe start walking, start exercising a little bit. Your mood will be better. You can start taking those supplements that you really didn't have the motivation to take. You can start making dietary changes. And then hopefully over time, you can peel off the methylene blue and start using it less often as you don't need it as much to support your mitochondria. Because for the most part, what I love people to be able to do is use it as needed for when they need it. So when they're under more stress, if they have airplane flight they're going on, because it could be great for flying and jet lag, or if they have more stress at the house, like my kids are starting school this week and things are crazy. Like it's a methylene blue week over here that's more intense, for example. Or if they're feeling like they're getting sick, then they can take their methylene blue either as a prophylactic or as a higher dose to help them as an anti-infective. So, in addition, on the endurance side, the people that are in performance athletics, like we know that there's a potential for methylene blue to actually help with endurance because it can work just like oxygen in the cells and increase your aerobic capacity. And we're seeing this especially in that community. And I'm working with cyclists and marathon runners. And I had a dude here in Colorado that did the Leadville race, the 100-mile ultra marathon, and he cut out 3 hours from his time using methylene blue, taking 36 milligrams of methylene blue every 4 hours for his race. Yeah, so there's the endurance piece is really interesting, and we can piece that out if you want to. But there's that kind of like what I call in the medical speak is PRN, as needed, for when you want to really drive your metabolic function up, your mitochondrial function up, and not need it all the time. So in essence, I think that's like the major breakdowns I would say would be best.
Where do you find, having now been using methylene blue for around 5 years, I think you said, where do you find your dose usually falling? In what sort of circumstances? Like this is a big week, for example, right?
Yeah. So a lot of this depends, right? So a good example would be my regular dosing is typically maybe about 4 milligrams every other day. So not a huge amount, right? Because I've been doing this for a while. I'm relatively well optimized. However, about 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, I partially tore my calf. And it was uncool, man, entirely. And so, but as a result of that, I mean, I love helping people. I know all the tools and tricks. I didn't want to use them all on me, but I have, of course. And I'm doing much better now. I'm walking, and thankfully I didn't fully tear it. But in that acute setting, I was using much more methylene blue than I would typically. So I was using 16 to 36 milligrams of methylene blue twice daily, for about 5 days. Just because what that does is it's, when there's a lot more inflammation in the body, right? Because you have to create this inflammatory response. What I'm trying to do is help that inflammatory response help heal the tissue, but at the same time, not causing a systemic reaction, right? And so there's lots of other things that went into my protocols, but what I worry about oftentimes when people have more of like an acute systemic kind of thing like that is that they get a lot of inflammation, they get like a leaky gut, and their brain gets leaky, and then they get brain fog, and then they get mold reactivation and Lyme and all the things. And so what methylene blue can do is help tamper down that systemic inflammation, which could be really helpful. But that's kind of an extreme example, but like as the Leadville guy is too. But for me, when I'm traveling, for example, if I'm going to like a conference or going to be away for a little while, I typically go to about 8 to 16 milligrams a day for a period of time. And then I'll wean it off when I come back. But it's that extra support that can go a long way because you're under more stress. For example, so a good example here is flying. When you're on an airplane, typically most of you that are listening are at 0 feet of seawater. You're at sea level when you're getting on an airplane. As soon as you get pressurized on an airplane, that pressurization, what that feels like is actually because they're simulating you being at an altitude. Typically that altitude is 8,000 feet. So you've just went from 0 to 8,000 feet in about 5 seconds as soon as they close the cabin door. And that's why people actually get very tired initially when they get on a plane, is because all of a sudden like they're not getting as much oxygen, because 8,000 feet, you're going from 21% oxygen to about 16% oxygen. So fun fact, also, I live in Colorado. My elevation is about 5,500 feet. So that delta, that change for me, if you want to have less jet lag, move to Colorado and fly places because it is
Totally.
much better.
Yeah.
Do you remember that when you lived here?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've also, and I'm curious if this is kind of a, rabbit hole in and of itself, but I get really into reading research about people and populations who live at high elevation, some of the adaptations that can happen there for people who especially move to high elevation after not being raised there, because the people who are raised there are just superhuman Sherpas for the most part. But for the mere mortals like us, there are adaptations that we can benefit from when you spend a significant amount of time up at elevation, whether it's training for a few days or weeks, or I think what I learned mostly is that after somewhere around 4 or 5 years, there are some other adaptations that actually kick in that might stick around in terms of the cardiovascular system and that sort of thing. So maybe you could just riff on that a little, because it's...
Yeah, I don't know about those long-term adaptations. That's interesting. So I'll have to look into that because I'm just at that 4 to 5 year mark here in Colorado. But you're totally right that people come here all the time to do. So there's the Boulder community where I live just next to is big ultra marathon community here, and also Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs is about 7,000 feet, and Boulder is about 5,500. And it's obvious. Like, you come here with that hypoxic stress, what happens is that you release a hormone in the body from the kidneys called epogen, or EPO for short. This is the doping drug that people know about, with Lance Armstrong finally admitting on Oprah many years later that he took it, and all those kinds of things. And so EPO as a drug increases your red blood cell density, the number of red blood cells that you have in circulation. And as a result of that, you can carry more oxygen. And so living at altitude here, you have like an initial 3 to 5 days where you have a change in your plasma volume, so which is like how much liquid you have in your bloodstream, and that that plasma volume change can help you feel better pretty quickly. However, like long term, it takes about 3 months to have an adaptation where you have that epogen raise, and then you have increased red blood cell density. But then then it's been great. I go on an airplane, I go to California, I come to Texas, whatever. I'm like, I feel so much better, and I love coming back down to altitude, from altitude, and my Oura ring loves me as well.
Yeah.
It's like, what have you just done? What have you just done? like I get like maybe a 90 once a month, but like when I go off elevation and I go on, even in a hotel room, like a shitty hotel room, I'm getting like 95s. It's like,
Wow.
I'm at a conference, I shouldn't be getting 95s, but it's because of that. So, but the thing about it is that hypoxic stress causes all these physiologic things to change, right? So we get stem cells released, we get more mitochondria that get produced in our cells, and then we get more red blood cells. And so that hypoxia is really interesting. And I've been in hyperbaric and hypoxic world for a long time, kind of understanding how this all can be beneficial. And where methylene blue comes in here is that, especially for an acute hypoxic stress, like this low oxygen stress that's on an airplane, your cell's like, holy shit, I can't make enough energy. I don't have enough oxygen around. And so the methylene blue comes in. It can work just like oxygen in your cells to help you produce more energy, even at a lower amount of oxygen percentage. And then it also has a protective effect against radiation, so that you have more radiation if you're higher and closer to the sun, more UV. And then you also have like poor air, poor people, not poor people like in monetary, but like they might be, coughing on you and things like that. And so methylene blue can be very protective in those capacities. So I use it, and I think, elevation, there have been, and just kind of going back, there have been some studies looking at like the longevity benefit from somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 feet, somewhere around there. But there's also some studies showing that there's a higher risk of suicide actually at these higher elevations if people live here for long periods of time as well. So there's that.
I also believe that. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if you live in Colorado, as you well remember, like there's a lot of sun here, right? So it's sunny like almost all year round. And so we do have that benefit, but I'm not sure why the increased risk in suicidality at high elevation. But there is that piece as well to be aware of. But for the most part, the hypoxic stress is good for all of us to do at certain periods of time. This is just even just CO2 training. Like if you're looking at breath holds and things like that, and learning how to just hold your breath a little bit longer and being more tolerant to elevated CO2s and low oxygen levels, this can go a long way. And actually cool. I have a friend, I don't know if you know Brian McKenzie, if he's been on your show before, but
he hasn't.
Brian's a cool guy. Yeah, Brian's a cool guy. And we talk about hyperoxic training. And we also talk about hypoxic methylene blue training, actually, because that is a great combination, actually. And he's actually been showing some really cool things there.
That's fascinating. Now, I have a couple of guesses about why the suicide rates might be higher, and the first would be just social isolation because it's so much more difficult. And if you're caught outside after dark, you might die. Whereas in other, living in the South now, that's just not really true in other places. And so I think that isolates people a lot more. But also the stress of having uh, a lower amount of oxygen saturation over time where you don't get a break, I would imagine that also has some negative consequences on your psyche. I know that my cognition wasn't as great up there as it is
Interesting.
down at sea
Yeah.
level. Playing
Yeah.
saxophone was a lot harder due to not having as much oxygen and air. Like there are lots of things. There are pros and cons, but definitely there's benefit in going up and down. It seems, and there are also different thresholds where it's like 5,500 is way different from 10,000 or 12 or 15 or 20.
Yeah. We have a number of people that use methylene blue living at those kinds of altitudes because they can't tolerate being there. The couple, like I think Evergreen's up at like 7 or 8,000 feet, right? So
Right.
it's high.
Yeah.
It's high up there. And so we have everybody that comes to Colorado to visit me, they get methylene blue when they get off the plane. Hopefully they got the methylene blue before they left, but if not, when they arrive. And I have friends that have houses in places all around Colorado. People come visit, they have oxygen concentrators there for people too. That's not ideal because you don't want to use the concentrator if you can avoid it because it's going to prevent you from having the acclimatization. But if you're going to be there just a couple of days, then it can really work to your benefit to having that around. But yeah, I have a lot of people that have actually been starting to use methylene blue for climbing and going and mountaineering and using it on these bigger mountains because it gives you that additional oxygen capacity without it being oxygen. It's just giving you more energy capacity at a lower oxygen percentage and also decreasing inflammation as well, and that sort of stress that's happening on the mitochondria. So, but I agree with you on the social isolation piece. I think that's a big one. Living at altitude, and it's certainly a lot colder here as well. And then I also would say that if you already have any like underlying pulmonary issues, it's going to be harder, right? I mean, I worked in the hospital for many years, and I didn't understand it initially why everybody that was leaving the hospital, not everybody, but so many people, excuse me, in comparison to working in California, we're leaving the hospital on oxygen. So, like, I would actually recommend if people had pulmonary issues, like you had to leave Colorado. Like going to go back to sea level is going to give you more years of life. So there is that piece for sure. But I think the sweet spot is probably where we are. I think it's anything a little bit higher than 6,000, 7,000 feet gets to be high, really high. Unless you're like you said, a Sherpa, and you're used to living at 12,000 feet in Lhasa in Tibet or something like that. So
Totally. Now, what about the interactions between methylene blue and SSRIs or supplements or anything else? What do you need to be aware of?
yeah, so when you're looking at methylene blue, the main aspects of it are we're increasing mitochondrial function. Okay. So the main thing I like to tell people across the board is that if you're increasing energy in detox, you might get symptoms related to increasing energy in detox, right? And that could be your classic sort of detox kinds of symptoms, a little bit of abdominal discomfort, diarrhea, constipation, headache, irritability. But the thing about those kinds of flu-like symptoms is that if you start off at low doses and you increase it slowly over time, those symptoms are typically mild and typically will go away as you increase your dose. So detox symptoms are probably the most common, especially if you're going up too fast with your dosing. So like mild headache, mild abdominal discomfort, those kinds of things, like flu-like illness kinds of symptoms. So that's common, but if you start off at low doses, not a big deal, and you can just titrate your dose as you go and be well supported, especially if you're going to increase your dosing. So if I have people on anti-infective doses at 50 milligrams twice daily for for a pathogenic bacteria in their gut or something like that, then I'm going to be giving them more antioxidant support at the same time, and more like things like activated charcoal or benzoyl more binders to help them kind of get rid of stuff. But from an interaction medication perspective wise, methylene blue works as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which means that it increases serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. As a result of that, many of the people that are out there, unfortunately, but some people it does help, are on SSRIs and SNRIs, which are kind of the newer age, newer classification of serotonergic drugs used for depression. Now, side note is that we now know that depression is not a serotonin deficiency. Okay. This is something that I learned when I was in medical school, that people needed SSRIs because they had low serotonin levels. And as a result of having low serotonin levels, they needed to be on SSRIs. So we now know that people that have depression do not have any lower levels of serotonin than people that do not have depression. Okay. However, these can be helpful in some people because it can help artificially increase their serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine levels so that they feel better. So, and I'm not discounting that. I think in some people that can be very, very helpful. My argument to this, and maybe later if we have time, for many of these people, it's actually a GABA deficiency. It's related to the brakes of their brain, the neurotransmitter system called the GABA system that helps relax firing of our brain. And when that's deficient, increases our anxiety, our depression, and our inability to sleep. But that being aside for a minute, let's go back to serotonin and norepinephrine. So if you're taking drugs like these SSRIs, for example, that increase serotonin, and you're taking methylene blue that also does the same, there is a hypothetical interaction between these two kinds of medications and therapies. And so what is the risk there? The risk is hypothetically something called serotonin syndrome. If you ask 100 doctors if they've ever seen serotonin syndrome, 2 will raise their hand and 1 will be wrong because it's very, very, very rare. Okay. Now, is it possible? Yes, but it's really only possible clinically with IV methylene blue and high doses of oral serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now, if you're on an SSRI though, or SNRI, or a dopaminergic drug like Parkinson's medications, for example, then I do recommend that you follow very closely with a physician if you want to take methylene blue. I know it's very safe clinically. I use it all the time in combination, but I only recommend you do it if you're working with a provider just in case. Typically what will happen if you do start combining these medications, combining a medication like an SSRI with methylene blue, is that you will sometimes get some GI distress sometimes because 90% of the serotonin that we make is not made in our brain. It's made in our gut. And so if you're increasing more serotonin in your gut, you're going to get more of that serotonin in your gut. And the other piece here, which is so important too, Abel, is that it's dose dependent. So lower doses of methylene blue, 4, 8, 16 milligrams, are not going to have a huge effect on serotonergic reuptake. Okay. You're going to have some, but not a lot. Interesting thing here as a side note, again, here, but important, is that there are certain people out there that have talked about how methylene blue doesn't work for most people, that it's just only working because it makes you feel happier because it gives you more serotonin. And that's the only reason why people feel better when they take it. And so that could be not further from the truth in general, but there is a small inclining there that yes, people that take methylene blue do typically feel a mood boost. That is for sure. But the overarching thing that's happening with taking methylene blue is because of that mitochondrial support that you're giving it. And this is even in mental health disorders. Like if you have bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, or more significant mental health issues, there's a significant component here of mitochondrial dysfunction. And that's the piece where methylene blue is so, so important, because what you can do is you can start adding it on, like we've been discussing, these lower doses, 4, 8, 16, and then people start feeling better. And then you can actually see them improve their life in other ways because they have the motivation, they have the cognition, they have the mood to be able to do that. So methylene blue is working on the serotonergic system. That's not why methylene blue works. In essence, that's a small piece of it. But when you're on medications that are increasing serotonin, dopamine, or norepinephrine, be careful with your dosing. Go very, very slow and work with your provider. One other piece to say here is that people with high blood pressure sometimes are more sensitive to methylene blue than people that do not have high blood pressure. So if you have high blood pressure, it's important that you work with a provider, especially if you're on blood pressure medications, and make sure that your blood pressure does not go too high when you take methylene blue. Again, this is dose dependent. So with my patients that have high blood pressure, that are on medications, and I want to start them on methylene blue, I start them at very low doses, and I have them check their blood pressure 2 hours after having the methylene blue, and then check it 2 hours later and see how they do. And if their blood pressures are okay, we keep going up. If they go up, then we don't keep going up, because some people are going to be more sensitive to other people. But in some groups of people, interestingly enough, their blood pressure goes down. And you know why? Because their inflammation goes down. So if inflammation goes down, blood pressure is going to go down correspondingly if blood pressure is up because of inflammation. Some people have the opposite effect where inflammation is really, really high, and methylene blue actually actually binds something in there that's causing their blood pressure to be low, something called nitric oxide. And that's another piece if you want to go into that. But there are people out there that have very very low blood pressures. Things like what is it called? Or like POTS, for example, so positional positional orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So they have low blood pressure. Methylene blue sometimes can actually help these patients actually increase their blood pressure and function better because it's binding some of these inflammatory mediators in the bloodstream, specifically something called inducible nitric oxide, which is something that gets released when you have inflammation infections. And nitric oxide could be good. It usually is good, but if it's circulating in the system because of inflammation, infection, and trauma, it is bad. It increases pain, it increases blood vessel dilation, it decreases blood pressure. And that's what methylene blue can do, is these low doses can help neutralize that.
And what about engaging the parasympathetic and GABA and the rest of that? I'd love to talk some more about that. It's interesting that methylene blue, when you take it, or at least when I have, the experience isn't like some sort of drug. It's much more like an alignment with how you should feel, right? It's like, oh, I remember feeling like this, but it's been a minute, right? It's more clarity, focus, but it can also help with sleep. It's not something that's like an upper, unless you're kind of reaching that upper threshold of maybe where your dose should be. And then in that case, I have experienced some like raciness or just like a little bit of feeling overstimulated. But how do you think about all of this?
My sense here, Abel, is that I look at it in a couple of different ways, but the main way that I've been thinking about it lately is what I've been calling the sympathetic spiral of doom, which is this spiral that many of us get into where we kind of get stuck in fight or flight. If you get stuck in fight or flight, there's so many different reasons why this could be. This could be from trauma when you were a child. It could be from a terrible illness. It could be from a family member getting ill, a death in the family. There's so many different kinds of things. It could just be from...
By the way, it just happened to me. I just had a car accident a couple months ago, was rear-ended, and like feeling like you're trapped in your own body, that fight or flight thing is terrible. And we've all been there at some point.
We've all been there, right? And that's this sympathetic overdrive. And what happens is that what that starts doing is having a significant effect on hormones, on mitochondria, on so many aspects of your biology. And then you start getting mitochondrial dysfunction. And what happens is that as the mitochondria start dysfunctioning because of all those stress hormones, the mitochondria are like giving signals for you to make more energy to try to compensate for the capacity that they don't have. And then it becomes a sort of circular spiral where things just get worse and worse and worse. And then your stress hormones get depleted and your antioxidants get depleted and your B vitamins and everything else in the process. And so how do you break the cycle? Well, you break the cycle by both addressing the mitochondrial piece, but that's not the only piece. You have to break the actual sympathetic spiral. And so the main neurotransmitter system involved on that side is your GABA system. So GABA aminobutyric acid is your primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it is the brakes of the brain. It is the brakes of the person that should have stopped before rear-ending you, right, Abel? So like the brakes of the brain calm things down. And when we're hyper stressed and those neurotransmitters that are involved in like that stress response are up really high for long periods of time, it depletes our GABA. And if GABA gets depleted, we have higher levels of anxiety, of depression, of insomnia, because what GABA is that brakes of the brain. And one of the main ways that people can experience this is in our thought generator. So our brain is constantly producing thoughts, unless you take a drug or you're in a flow state where the mind becomes quiet. But in general, we on average have about 70,000 thoughts per day. And that's on average. If you're stressed, you're anxious, you're depressed, you have on average about 120,000 thoughts per day. It doesn't mean they're unique thoughts. They're just 120,000 thoughts. So I always like to say in correspondence to that, those numbers, don't believe everything you think. Don't believe most things that you think, because that's this thought generator. It's just trying to keep us alive. And if we're sympathetically dominant, 120,000 thoughts per day, you can't sleep, you feel tired, but you're wired. It's like all these kinds of things. And so if you can enhance the GABA system by supporting it in multiple different ways, that's when you can start getting your brain to come back and down regulate off that fight or flight and back into more of a balanced oscillation between that parasympathetic mode and sympathetic mode. Parasympathetic is our rest digest, and sympathetic is our fight or flight. Sympathetic is what we need to get rid of, get it for danger. But for most of us, most of us throughout the day should be more parasympathetic overall than we are sympathetic. And unfortunately, that's not how our culture works. We're the hustle culture. We're the culture where we'll sleep when we're dead. And I had in medical school, we had shirts that were made that said with my friends that said sleep is for quitters. So I mean, these are things that we do and I grew up in New York, and New York, the city that never sleeps, and all these kinds of things. And so, but if we can start engaging our parasympathetic nervous system by enhancing the GABA side, then we can actually detoxify. We can actually heal. We can actually, for those of you out there that love to exercise, you can actually build more muscle and make more gains with less work overall. Because if you're overstressing and overtraining, you are not giving yourself enough time to signal that GABA system to start helping you relax. If you don't have enough GABA around, you're not going to have enough growth hormone around, because when GABA goes up, growth hormone goes up too, by the way, right? And so these are really important kinds of things. And so in my practice, I'm always looking at engaging that parasympathetic mode by leveraging the GABA system. But the problem there, Abel, is that you can't just take a GABA supplement. That's not the answer, because the thing about GABA supplements is that GABA is too big of a compound to get across into the brain. If it does work for you, if you take GABA and it feels good, it could mean that you have a leaky brain, that your brain is allowing things to get across that shouldn't get across. And that often is corresponding to a leaky gut. A leaky gut is very common, but if you can seal the leaky gut up, you can typically seal the brain. So the best way to heal up the GABA system over the long term is to optimize vitamins, minerals, nutrients, gut health, lifestyle, but this can take time. So in my world, what I do is I give the cofactors that help GABA get converted into the brain. So GABA gets converted in the brain from another neurotransmitter called glutamate. Glutamate is our primary excitatory neurotransmitter, actually, and GABA is our primary inhibitory. About 80% of the brain's neurotransmission is just those two neurotransmitters. People think about norepinephrine and dopamine, serotonin, superstars, but those are small players compared to glutamate and GABA. So if you can help that system work better, where glutamate can convert to GABA better, so you have B6 and magnesium actually are the most two important cofactors there. So I'll give some of that. And then I'll also look at how you can enhance the GABA system by the receptor itself and enhancing the amount of GABA produced, or not the amount of GABA produced, but the amount of support you're giving to the GABA receptor, so that you can make that receptor work better by not deplete it in the process. Because the problem is, like most of the drugs out there, like your benzodiazepines, your sleep drugs, alcohol is everybody's famous GABAergic drug. Those all deplete GABA over time, and then you're going to give you higher risk of dependence, withdrawal, and tolerance. So you need more, you can't get off of it easily, those kinds of things. And what they do is they bind to the receptor very, very tightly. So they deplete GABA in the system as well. So you get this corresponding increase in anxiety and insomnia and depression and things, especially if you're not getting as much as you need over time because you're more tolerant to these kinds of things. So the way I think about it is combining things on the receptor that enhance affinity, but also that can bind directly to where GABA would bind on the receptor, so that you can prevent that depletion. And there's some really cool compounds out there. My favorite is something called agarin, which is from a psychedelic mushroom called the flyagaric mushroom. Do you know the flyagaric mushroom?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Nintendo mushroom of lore.
Yes, red cap, white spots, Luigi, Mario, Alice in Wonderland, Santa Claus. It is psychedelic, but not the psychedelic like tripping on like a regular psilocybin mushroom. It's more of a kind of twilightish relaxation kind of psychedelic. But there's a non-psychedelic and non-toxic compound in there called agarin, which is a long-acting compound that works on the GABA receptor, and it sticks on the GABA receptor exactly where GABA would bind. So we use it for sleep because it's about a half-life of about 6.5 hours. So it sticks on there for a while. So immediately you can work on sleep by leveraging the GABA system. Immediately you can work on anxiety and stress by leveraging the GABA receptor, but doing it in a more comprehensive way is ideal, so you don't deplete GABA and pay the piper later because of something you're taking now.
Right. Very quickly, I would love for you to also talk about hyperbaric therapy. When should it be implemented? What is it doing in the body? And how accessible do you see this being as a therapy for people in the future? Because right now it's, there are some that you can buy or use at home and that sort of thing, but not for most people, right? So what are we looking at with this sort of thing?
Yeah, so I guess the context for me clinically is that I started off in hyperbaric medicine for a decade. It's from about 2012 to about 2024-ish, 2023, like maybe a little bit earlier, maybe 2020. That's all that I did was talk about hyperbaric medicine. But in the beginning, very early in the beginning, I realized that if you're going into a hyperbaric chamber, you needed to have some capacity to make energy effectively in there. Because what hyperbaric therapy in essence is doing is supersaturating the body with a huge amount of oxygen. We combine oxygen with pressure, increase atmospheric pressure, and that drives a whole lot more oxygen in circulation, not just on red blood cells, which typically carry it, we were talking about earlier with that epigen hormone, but also into the liquid of your bloodstream and into the plasma. That huge amount of oxygen is going to go into your body. It's going to help you make more energy, so that ATP that we talked about, but it's also going to cause reactive oxygen species, this oxidative stress kind of thing. And so that's good, just like exercise is good, but it's only good if you can tolerate that. And the problem I found is that if you were sicker, more inflamed, you'd been having issues for many, many years, and we put you in a hyperbaric chamber, and all of a sudden you had all this oxidative load, you did not feel good. And you did not feel good at all. And so over the years, I've kind of gravitated towards more of a system where I understand hyperbaric therapy as this fantastic tool for healing, for recovery, for wounds especially. But it's almost always done in the context of optimizing your health in the same breath. The only time it's not done in that way is more for an acute issue. So acute trauma, acute like surgery, injury. So when I injured my calf a couple weeks ago, it is fantastic as leveraging your body's capacity to heal faster. It decreases inflammation, decreases swelling, stem cell release. It's an anti-infective. It improves the lymphatic flow, immune system function. And so it does all those things very, very quickly and very, very efficiently, more efficiently than you can do on your own. So like, for example, if you get have a surgery, you can heal from the surgery about 50% faster in general. Like a calf injury like mine, which will probably really take about 6 to 8 weeks to heal on average, typically. Like I'm going to probably be good in about 4 as things have been going. I'm obviously not just using hyperbaric therapy, lots of other things too, right? So it's not like I'm doing anything in like a little box or silo here to do that. But I love hyperbaric therapy as that acute stimulus to do all the things that I just mentioned, right? But long-term, if you have a long-term issue, like chronic Lyme, or you have mild cognitive impairment, chronic pain, Parkinson's, the list goes on, autistic spectrum, lots of kids that see a lot of benefit. If you don't get your house in order first, if you don't start getting that cellular architecture working better, that mitochondria working better, then you're not going to see the long-term benefits. And so this is like, you can't out-supplement a bad diet. You can't hyperbaricize a bad diet. Like McDonald's and alcohol every day is not going to, if you're doing that, you're not going to see the benefits of a longevity protocol, because like there's actually good studies now that longer hyperbaric protocols, 30 to 40, sometimes more sessions, can rebuild the architecture of your body, new blood vessels, new stem cells that develop into tissue, and new connective tissue, and new neurons, a new heart, new cartilage, new bone, like all these kinds of things. And so that's all happening. However, you need to have that foundation in order. So I use a lot of methylene blue in my protocols for the longer hyperbaric protocols now, because it's that mitochondrial support while we're trying to get their foundation of mitochondrial support done and optimized over 6 months or longer in some people. And then there's also nuances as far as pressures, like milder pressures that you might find like in a home unit are better for neurocognitive kinds of things, wellness, jet lag, recovery, those kinds of, I have one of those in my house. And then for more systemic issues, deeper inflammation, that's when the hard chamber is going to deeper pressures. 1.8 to 2.4 is better. So I have a 1.3 at my house, but when I had my calf injury, I was in a 2.4 chamber for 90 minutes with air brakes, because that's what I needed, because the deeper you go, the more stem cells that you're going to release. But the context for me is always important, Abel, because there's when people are listening, it's like, oh, there's methylene blue, there's GABA, there's like hyperbarics. Like, what does this dude really do? And so for me, like clinically, what I'm doing is I'm trying to create a foundation for people. And that foundation is based on the work that we have at our nonprofit called Health Optimization Medicine. And that nonprofit is training practitioners on how to optimize health. Main thing is metabolomics that I mentioned earlier. And that piece is looking at cellular data and optimizing that over the long term, but looking at circadian rhythms and chronobiology and toxic exposures, and also looking at the psychosocial emotional aspects of things as well, and adding all those things in. But those things take a long time. It's not like if you took 45 years to get to how you feel right now, it's not like tomorrow you're going to feel better doing those things. You can feel a little bit better, but that's where things like methylene blue come in. That's where things like leveraging the GABA system come in. That's where things like working with a therapist and doing trauma work and whatever it might be, that's where those things come in. And then about 3 to 6 months later, typically that's when hyperbaric therapy comes in, because that's when somebody's optimized enough that I can go, okay, now you're going to be really able to utilize all this oxidative stress, this oxygen that's bringing in, to help leverage that and see the benefits. Because if you've started too early, you just don't see the long-term benefits there. So the cadence for me is health optimization medicine, then immediate tools to help you along that path, and then longer term tools that are going to help you over the long term as well. So that's kind of the way I like to frame it.
I like that framework. Awesome. Dr. Scott, what is the best place for people to find your work, transcriptions, and everything that's coming next?
So my personal website is Dr. Scott Sherr, DrScottsherr.com. And you can find most of my companies and my consulting there: Hyperbaric Consulting, Health Optimization Medicine Consulting, and then my companies. The one company that we were talking about by way of methylene blue and the GABAergic things is Transcriptions. It's like the word prescription, but with a TRO in front. That's at transcriptions.com, at Transcriptions on Instagram. And Transcriptions has a couple different products that are based on methylene blue. In fact, we were the first company to develop a methylene blue product for commercial use back in 2020. And that's one called Blue Cannatine. That's methylene blue with nicotine, caffeine, and CBD, along with methylene blue. And that's for focus stimulant, fantastic for that. And then we have something called Just Blue, which is 16 milligrams of pure methylene blue. And then we have some GABAergic products, something called Trocom and Troz for anxiousness, stress during the day. Trocom's fantastic. It combines things that works on the GABA receptor, as I was describing, along with Troz that has GABAergic things in it, that agarine from the psychedelic mushroom, along with other aspects, other compounds that are working on other aspects of sleep architecture, but enhances sleep architecture. And we have something called the buccal troche, which is these cool dissolvable lozenges that are scored. You can have a quarter, half, or full, and you can figure out your dose. They dissolve in your mouth. If you don't want to be blue, though, you can just swallow the methylene blue ones. That's okay. But the nice thing about the buccal absorption in the mouth is that it's faster. The ingredients are more bioavailable, and it doesn't go through what's called first pass metabolism in the liver, which degrades things, anything almost, but it's supplements included. So you can check it out at transcriptions.com. We have tons of information on methylene blue. Be careful of your quality out there, everybody. Watch out for liquids. Watch out for forged certifications of analysis from random companies around the world. We've been seeing a lot of that lately, so be mindful there. And then the nonprofit is called Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, and the website is homehope.org. And if you're a practitioner, you're interested in more training, you want to learn how to optimize health from a foundational perspective using metabolomic science and other things like that, check it out at homehope.org.
Right on. Dr. Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, man. This has been fun.
Hey, Abel here one more time. And if you believe in our mission to create a world where health is the norm, not sickness, here are a few things you can do to help keep this show coming your way. Click like, subscribe, and leave a quick review wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts. You can also subscribe to my new Substack channel for an ad-free version of this show in video and audio. That's at abeljames.substack.com. You can also find me on Twitter or X, YouTube, as well as Fountain FM, where you can leave a little crypto in the tip jar. And if you can think of someone you care about who might learn from or enjoy this show, please take a quick moment to share it with them. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.